July 10, 1968. Faith Temple Church, 147th Street. Bumpy Johnson's funeral drew hundreds. Street operators, community leaders, Italian mobsters in dark suits standing beside numbers runners in their Sunday best. Frank Lucas arrived late, alone, carrying a briefcase everyone assumed held flowers or condolence cards. He walked past the Italian delegation, past the Genovese representatives who'd worked with Bumpy for decades, past every power player in Harlem's underworld, walked straight to the casket, set the briefcase on the floor, opened it. $100,000. Cash, stacked in neat bundles. Bills so crisp they looked freshly printed. The room went silent. Not shocked silent. Something deeper. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone realizes the power structure just shifted and no one's quite sure how. What Frank did next wasn't about money. It was about succession. About claiming territory without territory existing. About demonstrating understanding in a language everyone spoke but few mastered. And every mobster in that church understood exactly what they were witnessing. Frank Lucas had been Bumpy Johnson's driver, his runner, his student for 15 years. Not family, not blood, not even particularly close by most standards. But Bumpy had taught him everything. How to move weight without attracting attention. How to maintain relationships with suppliers who operated in 3 countries. How to keep police paid and politicians comfortable. How to build systems that survived individual arrests and continued generating revenue through upheaval. The heroin trade in Harlem ran through multiple operators. No single person controlled it. The Italians controlled import and wholesale distribution. Black operators handled street-level sales and neighborhood management. Everyone took their percentage. Everyone stayed in their lane. Everyone understood that violating these boundaries meant war. This system worked because Bumpy Johnson maintained the structure. He mediated disputes between operators who hated each other, kept peace between factions that would have destroyed each other without his presence, ensured the Italians got paid consistently so they didn't feel the need to take over directly and risk community backlash. With Bumpy dead, that entire structure faced collapse. The Italians would push for more control. They'd been restrained by respect for Bumpy, not by any inherent limitation. Without him, they'd simply take what they wanted. Street operators would fight each other for scraps of territory. The whole system risked fracturing into open war that would attract federal attention and destroy everyone's operations. Everyone knew this. Everyone was calculating their next move. Everyone was watching everyone else to see who would make the first claim. Frank Lucas had been calculating longer than any of them. He'd watched Bumpy work for 15 years. Watched how respect was earned through consistency, not violence. How power transferred through recognition rather than seizure. How succession happened in systems where there were no official titles or corporate structures or legal frameworks. He'd learned that power in the underworld wasn't about who had the most guns. It was about who understood the unwritten rules well enough to rewrite them in real time. This was his moment to demonstrate that understanding. Bumpy's funeral wasn't just grief. It was a power summit. Every significant operator in New York's heroin trade was present. Every Italian family had sent representatives, not just to show respect, to assess the situation, to see who would try to fill Bumpy's role, to determine if they needed to step in directly or if someone credible would emerge. The Genovese family had worked with Bumpy for decades. Profitable relationship, stable, predictable. They preferred maintaining that arrangement if possible. But they wouldn't tolerate chaos, wouldn't accept leadership from someone they didn't respect, wouldn't wait long before imposing their own solution. Frank understood that whoever established themselves at this funeral would have the positioning to control what came next. Not through violence. Not through loud declarations that could be challenged. Through symbolic action that everyone recognized, understood, and most importantly, accepted as legitimate. The briefcase full of cash was that action. But not for the reason most people assumed. $100,000 in 1968 was significant money, equivalent to $750,000 in later decades. Street value much higher once cut and distributed. Enough to fund operations for months. Enough to buy loyalty from dozens of street dealers. Enough to make a statement about resources and seriousness. But Frank wasn't trying to buy anything. He was demonstrating something more important. Something Bumpy had taught him about power and succession and legitimacy in systems that operated outside legal frameworks. He was showing that he'd learned from Bumpy, that he understood how power worked, that he respected the old guard while claiming space for himself, that he had resources but also restraint, that he could be trusted to maintain what Bumpy built rather than destroy it for personal gain. The cash wasn't a gift. It was a declaration. It was Frank saying, "I belong in this conversation." And he was making that declaration in a way that made opposition very difficult. The silence held for maybe 10 seconds. Long enough for everyone to register what they were seeing. Long enough for the mathematics to happen in every calculating mind in that church. 10 seconds is forever in a room full of operators who make decisions in milliseconds. Frank stood beside the casket. Didn't say anything. Didn't perform emotion. Didn't explain. Just stood there with the briefcase open and the money visible. This was power. This was understanding. This was demonstration without declaration. An Italian capo named Anthony Benedetto shifted in his pew. He'd been the primary Genovese liaison to Bumpy. Had worked with him for 8 years. Negotiated deals. Mediated conflicts. He understood Harlem better than most of his associates. Understood the culture. Understood that what looked like chaos to outsiders was actually complex structure. He leaned to the man beside him. Whispered something. The man nodded. This was recognition. This was the moment Italian organized crime acknowledged what was happening. Not approval necessarily, but acknowledgement. Frank Lucas had just made a move that couldn't be ignored. Frank still hadn't moved. Just stood there, hands at his sides, expression neutral, not challenging anyone, not claiming anything explicitly, just present. Betty Shabazz sat in the front row. Malcolm's widow, friend to Bumpy's family, connected to community leadership in ways that transcended criminal enterprise. She watched Frank with interest, not shock, interest, like she was seeing something she'd expected but hadn't known would manifest this way. A street operator named Red stood up, walked to the casket, looked at the money, looked at Frank. Red had worked with Bumpy for 20 years. Had seniority, had respect, had assumed he'd be part of whatever leadership emerged. That's for the family? Red's voice was quiet, careful, testing. That's for Bumpy's legacy. What's the difference? The family gets taken care of regardless. That's already handled. This is about what he built, about keeping it intact, about demonstrating commitment to continuity. Red absorbed this. The distinction mattered. Frank wasn't trying to buy favor with Bumpy's widow, wasn't trying to look generous. He was making a structural statement about operational commitment. Red nodded slowly, sat back down. He understood. Everyone understood. The money wasn't charity. It was operational capital. It was Frank saying, "I have resources. I have respect for what Bumpy created. I intend to maintain it rather than fracture it. I'm investing in structure, not claiming territory." More importantly, it was Frank saying all of this without actually saying it. Without making claims that could be challenged or promises that could be held against him later. He was demonstrating Bumpy's first lesson: show, don't tell. Actions speak. Words are just noise. Another operator approached. Man named Jerome. Younger. Ambitious. He'd competed with Frank for Bumpy's attention over the years. Had assumed he'd be the one to step up after Bumpy died. Had probably prepared speeches. Had definitely prepared moves. That's a lot of cash to just leave sitting there. It's not sitting. It's working. Working how? Frank finally looked at him directly. Eye contact. Calm. Certain. Everyone in this church is making calculations right now. About what happens next. About who fills the vacuum. About whether Harlem stays stable or fractures into war. About whether the Italians take over directly. About whether federal attention comes down. This money answers those questions. How? Because it shows I learned from Bumpy. I'm not taking. I'm investing. I'm not claiming territory. I'm claiming responsibility for maintaining structure. Big difference. Jerome processed this. The mathematics were complex but clear. Frank had just positioned himself as the continuity candidate, the safe choice, the person who represented stability rather than change. Opposition to Frank now meant supporting chaos, supporting fracture, supporting the very thing everyone feared most. Jerome nodded, walked back to his seat without challenging further. This was the escalation, not violence, not confrontation, not dramatic speeches or territory claims. Just each person in the church adjusting their understanding of the power structure, recalculating their positions, accepting new reality. Anthony Benedetto stood, walked to the casket, looked at the money, really looked at it, then looked at Frank. The family wants to know your intentions. Same as Bumpy's. Keep the peace. Maintain boundaries. Make sure everyone gets paid consistently. Respect the structure that works. And if someone disagrees with that arrangement, then they're disagreeing with Bumpy's legacy, with proven structure, with 15 years of stability. That's their choice to make. But they should understand what they're choosing. This was the line that mattered. Frank wasn't claiming power for himself. He was positioning himself as Bumpy's continuation, as the structural heir rather than the power heir. Anyone who opposed him was opposing Bumpy, was choosing chaos over stability, was betting against proven systems. Benedetto understood this immediately, understood the politics, understood the brilliance of the positioning. Frank had just made opposition very difficult without making it impossible. He'd left room for negotiation while establishing clear terms. The family respects Bumpy's legacy. I know. We'll be in touch. Soon. I expect so. Benedetto returned to his seat. The entire Italian delegation relaxed slightly. Not approval, but acceptance that this was a person they could work with. That continuity was possible. That war might be avoidable. The church remained silent. Everyone processing. Everyone recalculating. Everyone adjusting to new reality. Frank closed the briefcase, left the money on the floor beside the casket, turned to address the church. Not from the pulpit, not from any position of elevation, just from where he stood, level with everyone else. Bumpy Johnson taught me that power isn't what you take. It's what you build, what you maintain, what you leave behind. His voice was level, calm, not performing, not selling, just stating. He built something in Harlem that worked, that kept people fed when legitimate economy failed them, that maintained peace when peace seemed impossible, that created structure in chaos. That system doesn't die with him unless we let it. He paused. Let the words settle. Let people absorb. I'm not here to claim his throne. I'm not here to declare myself anything. I'm here to ensure his structure survives. To make sure that 15 years of building doesn't collapse into 15 days of destruction. Another pause. Longer this time. Anyone who wants to maintain that structure, maintain that peace, maintain what works, you know where to find me. Anyone who wants something different, that's your right. Free country. But understand you'll be building something new from scratch, not continuing something proven. That's a harder path, riskier path, more expensive path. He let that mathematics settle. Let everyone calculate the cost of opposition versus the ease of continuity. Bumpy earned respect by being consistent, by being fair, by being someone his word meant something. I intend to honor that by being the same. Consistent, fair, reliable. Nothing more complicated than that. He walked back down the aisle, past the Italian delegation who remained seated but were nodding slightly, past the street operators who watched with new understanding and some relief, past everyone who'd come to mourn Bumpy and stayed to witness succession without blood. He didn't look back, didn't check reactions, didn't perform confidence. He just left. The money stayed beside the casket through the entire funeral, through the prayers, through the eulogies, through the final viewing. No one touched it. No one questioned it. No one suggested moving it. It sat there like a statement that everyone could read but no one needed to explain. After the service, after the casket was carried out, after most people had filed past, Bumpy's widow approached Frank outside. She didn't say anything about the money, didn't thank him, didn't acknowledge the display, just looked at him with something that might have been approval or might have been resignation or might have been both. He saw something in you. I know. Something he didn't see in others who were closer, who had more history, who expected more. I know that too. Don't waste it. I won't. That was the conversation. Nothing more. Nothing less. No emotional display. No promises beyond what had already been demonstrated. Anthony Benedetto approached as she walked away. Waited until she was out of earshot. Professional courtesy. The family wants a meeting. Next week. Tuesday. We need to discuss arrangements going forward. Same arrangements as before. Nothing changes except the face. Everything changes. Bumpy's gone. Bumpy's structure remains. That's what matters. That's what the money was about. Demonstrating commitment to structure over ego. Benedetto studied him for a long moment, calculating, assessing, deciding, then nodded. Tuesday, 2 p.m. You know the place. I know the place. The entire power transfer happened in under 2 hours. No violence. No dramatic declarations. No territory seized by force. No challenges issued or accepted. Just one symbolic gesture that everyone recognized and most accepted. This was power in its purest form. This was understanding. This was Frank Lucas demonstrating he'd learned from the master. Frank Lucas met with the Genovese family the following Tuesday. The meeting lasted 3 hours. They discussed percentages, territory boundaries, supplier relationships, distribution protocols, everything Bumpy had managed for decades. They agreed to maintain existing arrangements. Same percentages, same boundaries, same respect protocols Bumpy had established over 15 years of careful negotiation. The transition was clean, cleaner than anyone expected. No war, no fracturing, no federal attention. The system Bumpy built continued almost unchanged. Frank's reputation shifted overnight. He went from Bumpy's driver to Bumpy's successor in public perception. Not because he claimed the title, not because he seized territory, because he'd demonstrated understanding of what the title actually meant. He'd shown that he comprehended the difference between power and authority, between seizing and succeeding, between claiming and earning. Other operators tested him over the following months. Small challenges, boundary pushing, territory disputes that were really loyalty tests. Frank handled each one the way Bumpy would have. Firm but fair, consistent, no dramatic responses, no disproportionate violence. Just clear communication of boundaries and consequences. The challenges stopped within 6 months. The $100,000 became legendary. People told different versions as years passed. Some said it was $1 million. Some said Frank pulled it from his pocket like loose change. Some said he threw it in the air and let people scramble. Some said he burned half of it to prove he didn't need it. None of that was true, but the core remained accurate. Frank Lucas had walked into Bumpy Johnson's funeral with substantial cash and changed the power structure through symbolic action alone. The Italian families remembered this moment for years. Remembered that Frank understood theater, understood symbolism, understood that power was as much about perception as reality, about timing as much as resources. This made him someone they could work with, someone they understood, someone who spoke their language. Frank ran Harlem's heroin trade for the next 7 years, built his own supplier connections that bypassed Italian middlemen, developed the Blue Magic brand that became infamous for purity, made millions, lived large, eventually overreached, got caught, cooperated, went to prison. But for those 7 years, he maintained what Bumpy built. The structure held. The peace lasted longer than anyone expected. The system worked as designed. That funeral moment was why. That demonstration of understanding. That willingness to invest rather than take. that respect for legacy over immediate ego gratification. When people tell Frank Lucas's story, they focus on the heroin empire, the violence that came later, the downfall, the cooperation that made him infamous in street culture, the eventual redemption narrative he tried to build. But people who understand power tell a different story. They tell about the funeral, about the briefcase, about the moment Frank demonstrated he'd learned from the master, about how succession actually works in systems that operate outside legal frameworks. They tell about how one symbolic gesture accomplished what 100 violent acts couldn't, how showing understanding mattered more than showing strength, how investing in structure proved more valuable than seizing territory. That's the story that matters, not what he became later, not the empire or the fall, what he understood then, what he demonstrated in that church in front of everyone who mattered. Power isn't seized, it's recognized. Authority isn't claimed, it's granted by people who understand what they're granting. And on July 10, 1968, every mobster in that church recognized what Frank Lucas understood. Recognized that Bumpy's best student had just demonstrated his final lesson. The money stayed with Bumpy's family. Frank never asked for it back, never mentioned it again. It had already served its purpose. It had bought something money can't usually buy: legitimacy.